It's not a question, but it's a short remark to Alison, because you mentioned with Piotr Piotrowski. I'm here. You mentioned the Piotr Piotrowski text from 2010, I think, about this crucial moments, and you said that he did not develop this idea on writing around crucial moments in history. Yes, so the last book is about it exactly. It is around crucial moments in history, and also the introduction to this book. It was published in English. Under the title "Peripheries of the World Unite," but it is exactly about this. Yes, that crucial moment. We should write. His idea was to write history now around art history around this historically crucial moments. But for him, it was very important which date to choose. Yes, and he definitely focused on dates that were important from the point of view of politics. Yes, so it's just.
That's fabulous to hear. Yes, thank you. And I think in some sense this is the difficulty of working in somewhere like Louisiana, where I just don't have the same access that I used to in New York to text, but I will definitely find that one. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah, like 68, 89, this kind of dates, Yes, 56,
Yeah.
yes.
If I may add, I find it a little bit problematic, this concentration of some dates. It's problematic also because it's directly related to commemoration, and so with the quite political view on this, and I'm afraid that we reduce history of the sum of significant dates, and that will lack the question of continuity and long evolution if we are just focusing on some dates. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, history is always reductive. We've been talking about this, that there are always exclusions. We're never creating the completely full. And I think part of what I was trying to do is, yeah, there are salient dates, we might say. There are revolutionary years, in particular, as Piotrowski was saying, in the 20th century. But 1820 is actually a really arbitrary year in the grand scheme. Nothing is phenomenally going on in terms of, Napoleon is already passed from the realm of power. Europe is fairly settled. And so I think you could create one that both pivots around, like you were saying, monumental dates that are prioritizing a certain agenda, but also have dates in there that seem sort of not scaled in that same way. Might be sort of a solution.
Are we allowed to respond? I mean, now it's going to turn into a conversation between us, so I don't know if we're allowed to do that. But I was going to say that I thought that your presentations in some way were wonderfully complementary. In that, so initially when I was listening to your excellent talk, it was so impressive and so enthusiastic. But I also experienced a weird moment of Greenbergization. Suddenly I found myself looking for, but what is compelling? Or, what isn't this random? How, what, and of course, clearly you're coming from the point of view of teaching. So it makes perfect sense. What are you going to do when asked to teach a class about global art history? Just what does that mean? How are you going to present it to students who actually do not know the vertical art history, against the background of which, of course, we're constructing this counter model? Now, and then about the years, I would agree with Jérôme. There's a real kind of wave now of such publications. So one of the books that has been in the German bestseller lists for months is a book about the year 1913. But there's an awful danger in this, in that it really does monumentalize these singular moments at the expense, let's say, of having years collide with each other, of creating maybe relationships between years, not to mention the possibility of representing continuities or indeed discontinuities between them. But I felt that Jérôme, in some wonderful way, really complemented your talk in that his kind of correction, if you will, to your model alerted us to the danger that a horizontal art history that is a flat art history is not a good horizontal art history. In other words, there needs to be what I think was called scaling here before, some sort of dynamics that allows you to see that horizontal art history is not smooth, right? That it has its ruptures, its discontinuities, that it isn't necessarily a narrative, or it can be a narrative, but it can also be a single year. It can be a lot of these things, but to simply produce a version of it that confronts students with this kind of glut of images randomly produced, or distributed across a map, when they really have no clue about their context and about, then I think there's a real danger in this as well. So in that sense, I felt that your talks actually gave us both a version of it that was extremely instructive in your first talk, but also maybe some sense of the dangers involved if we push this to a point where it turns into some kind of random accumulation of images.
Can I respond quickly too? No, I absolutely understand, and I appreciate, both the criticism and the compliment at once. And I really did try to maintain in my talk a sense of my own awareness of the failure of it as it was ongoing, and my kind of continual attempt to modify it and make it different. And because I knew I was failing, and I think in the end I still landed on, wanting to issue a kind of call while also recognizing I'm not sure this is quite it yet, but here's an idea. In fact, the Clark talk had built within it maybe somewhat of a corrective that also has something to do with what you said, and that was that he acknowledged, and that talk is on YouTube. You can all find it if you're interested in this same spot that I started with. Where he said, in some sense it doesn't matter, the 1820 is an artifact, he called it, because in the end none of these works were publicly viewed until much, much later. The Jericho works were not put into the public until the 1860s, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you can make those odd connections between the moment of making, which is a magical moment, we all recognize that, and then the reception history has its own kind of dating that reorders and scales, and like you said, it makes it not smooth, it's craggy, it's like a lightning strike the way we're analyzing dates and monumentalizing them or reducing them. Thank you.
So I would like to put some comments. Thank you very much for this panel. It was really great. So I would like to be honest, I would like to comment every paper, but as we don't have time for this, I just want to tell to Sven that once Hungarian artist Gyula Power, he told me that what was the way they used Russian language. And he told me that he could read Marxist and communist texts, although when they traveled together to Moscow, he couldn't order tea or soup. So because they were not trained to do this, so they couldn't simply use this, the simple expressions. And the other remark is, I don't know whether Tanner Rander is already here. He was here yesterday. He is, to me, he is really one of the most important the set of artists in Estonia, and the way also he is very unconventional towards the capital regime imposed in arts. And I remember he was telling me, because he is trained as a lawyer, and he was working for many years as a lawyer, and then he switched to art. And he's very radical in his practice. He doesn't sell to private collectors and so on. And he told me that he was trained in this very sophisticated English, which was a language of success in this simply in this neighborhood, in this domain. But then he decided consciously to switch to this very rough Central European, East Central European accent in order to resist capitalism and appropriation by the language. So this is a very interesting attitude, because he works with his voice, because he's a performance and video artist. So you can hear a path watching his video works. So I think it's very interesting. And one other comment that you showed to us Mladen Stilinovic work, And actually, the quote is not that the artist who doesn't speak English is not an artist, but is no artist, which is even worse, because it doesn't mean, it doesn't rely to the absence, it relies to the lack of the quality. If someone is no artist, it means that, you know, it is the less of an artist than the Westerns. So this is just it.
Thank you so much. It's really useful. Yeah, no, I have no comment, just thank you.
This is a question for, actually it's a comment/question for Pavlina. Pavlina, thank you very much for your topic. I was, as you can imagine, very interested as an art architectural historian. I've been working myself a little bit on that. But what I was interested in is the way you bring together, and this is my question, and then I will come with a comment. You bring together Norbert Schulz and Lefebvre. Because I think that these are two, non-bringable together persons and theories. And here is my comment. I think that you address place using the Norbert Schulz theory of defining place, which is a very three-dimensional way of addressing it. It's a very Heideggerian way of addressing site, place, how space turns into place. But actually, you speak about space. You don't speak about place. And what came to my mind listening to you and looking at places that you have shown, and thinking also of my quite meager experience in terms of what you showed, I thought these are actually sort of suspended spaces. They are like no spaces, because they allow all kind of events to take place in places which are not meant to be such a place. So from this point of view, I think it's the space vision of the production of political space that addressed Lefebvre. And actually, this politicized space has such a long, long history beyond, doesn't it, with Rousseau and everybody, I mean Jean-Jacques.
Well, thank you for this comment. Yeah, of course, in my presentation, I'm just in the beginning of thinking about this theory, and I try to pull together all different views how to approach it. But I disagree with the space place notion in the end of your comment, because despite the fact that these places I showed just few examples. Look like sort of no place, they actually have very strong local meaning, you know, and they are really juncture of certain political, social happenings, which or events which took place there. And I really realized that during my research on performance art, because you know, as I said in that book, Walk Through Prague, I located all the places of the performances, and I cannot share the change in my mindset when I really got to the place where this performance took place, like in 1970s, and I could see the documentation which was used, and suddenly I was on that spot, and suddenly a totally different picture comes to your mind. You realize that the performance actually was totally different than you imagined for years. You know, one example is famous performance by Petr Stembera, where after 3 nights without sleep, he slept on a tree. And I always, from the documentation, imagine it as somewhere in the forest, you know, or like huge park, and him being alone in the middle of the night and all these things. And then when I was taken to that place, it was on a garden of a small house, you know, and there couldn't be different interpretation of that performance after you're at that spot. So all these moments led me to the thinking of how if you really concentrate on that place and its meaning in the history, all the events which kind of went through that place, and why these people chose that place, it opens up new ways of interpretation. That's what I wanted to say.
It is just a very short remark to Alison that actually there is 2 exhibitions to which has to be credit, which use this method. And one of them is in 1997 in Guggenheim Museum, curated by Robert Rosenblum, 1900, which showed a totally different picture about the end of the century as we generally used to have. And the other one, which is, I believe, even more important, this post-war exhibition organized by Okui Envezor in Munich, which put on the table Latin America and Africa, and dealt with not anniversary, but rather with a momentum and all the different reflections. So that was, I believe, a very, very good experience.
Hi, thank you. Just a brief question to Pavlina, since her presentation today wonderfully echoed the text I wrote in the performing art in the second public sphere on the reinvention of marginal spaces, art spaces in Romanian art. The question would be, I just used Lefebvre there, so just stuck to one methodological input. But no, it depends, because in the case, this is the point I actually wanted to make, that I think that sometimes it's good to have this international comparison once again in the region, because it may differ from the institutional situation from one country to the other. So the question would have been related to this notion of temporal cut. If we take the same years to compare, like 68, you will have, since I know that you also read my text already, so I was just wondering, if we take this as a case study, wouldn't we find that the reasons for the artists to choose those basement attics and other spaces to be different from one country to the other, because the institutional structures was different, but also the response to the political issues is different? Because in your case, it's the invasion, whereas in Romania is the period of cultural openness that starts in 68. So we have access finally to spaces. So the same year looks pretty much different if we make this horizontal cut around it.
Yeah, if I may just briefly comment on it. Yeah, that's the problem, which I'm totally aware of it. The asynchronicity of our histories, and from that, many other problems arise, and that's what I was thinking during your presentation. That the year you choose mean something completely different in every different region or country. So it's a great problem with that. And yeah, I was very inspired by your text and intrigued by the different conditions which led to the choice of these marginalized spaces or places, whatever we call them.
I would like to make a short remark that Sven speaker may want to reflect on, which is that each of the very interesting talks proved directly or indirectly that you cannot take history out of art history. So let's put this language issue in perspective. We have to see that in 1960s and 70s, as you proved, it was actually an achievement that artists of different countries and different languages tended to learn each other's language and tried to go for the common language of English. But think back of the interwar period where the international artists were, in every country across the board were fluently and without a problem corresponding with each other in German and French and English, very often added Italian and Dutch. And so we have to see that in the 1960s and 70s, we must celebrate that there is at least 2 languages that are being taught learned by some of the artists.
I don't want to be contentious, but I couldn't see who was speaking. Oh, I see. Hi. Oh, I see. Okay. I think you can take history out of art history. Someone said yesterday that you could make, or that Piotrowski was experimenting with art geography as opposed to art history. Didn't you say in his seminars he was doing that? And earlier experiments that I've done that aren't having to do with the single year focus are about disregarding time. I mean, formalism is a method in which you can totally disregard history, disregard time. I mean, it's very difficult to get away from the social historical model that we're in right now, but you can compare the formal qualities alone of a work that comes from antiquity to a work in the Renaissance to a contemporary work. New problems arise, I guess, when you do that, don't get me wrong, but I do want to say it is possible.
I wanted to say that the way how this panel was put together is a work of art. And congratulations to organizers. It was so amazing. I really enjoyed and learned a lot. And I have a comment with regards to Sven's talk. I observe within my archive, so archive of Eva Partum, the precise date when this English language kind of dominated or switched. And what I observed in my research is how the competence of English made access to the knowledge. And for instance, when you look at Świdziński texts about conceptual art from 70 or 71, he basically based his text on conceptual discourse on reading English magazines. And I think this is not only about communication, but this competence in English. It was like a circle in terms of spreading and distributing knowledges about Western art. I mean, my point is that male art accelerated distribution of Western discourse in terms of artists reading and writing articles about that, and this is what I observed. And I have a quick question to Pavlina, but maybe in the coffee break.
Maybe I could give my question as well, because it's also to Sven. I don't know whether you would entertain the notion of minor lingua francas also in Eastern Europe, because I mean, perhaps it's not always just about choosing which dominant colonial language or culture that you want to use and communicate with. And maybe there are other possibilities available. I mean, we discarded Russian very quickly, but maybe there was a moment in the 50s or maybe at the end of the 80s where Russian could have also played that role. There are also cases where artists maybe had dual languages, dual cultures, and they had to select which language to use. I mean, Katalin Ladek is a good example of that. Someone, an artist from the Hungarian minority was working in Vojvodina in Yugoslavia, and I've heard her explain that she chose to do her poetry in the late 60s in Serbian or Serbo-Croatian rather than Hungarian for various reasons and so on. So she made a choice about which language was best to communicate her work, and then moved to just sound, so sound poetry. And the final possibility is what about Esperanto? About have you come across that? I was trying to think of some examples. Were there artists in the period that you're looking at who used Esperanto as an alternative, as a sort of self-conscious alternative to dominant colonial linguistic structures, idea that there's a sort of egalitarian language without this burden of that we have been talking about? I mean, there's a contemporary example, but maybe I'll let you reply.
Right. Well, thanks so much for these suggestions. So I think I have a lot of interesting ideas about this, but they're still based on insufficient field research. In other words, there are many questions that I can't answer about the actual distribution of language use, let's say, by country. And so in a way, my paper was a bit conceptual in that I wanted to explore what somebody who maybe once we have done that research would be able to conclude based on a very small sample. So, I freely kind of admit that. But I will say that conceptually, the main thrust of my paper in some sense has been to sort of discredit the colonial language model that so dominates the discussion once you bring in particularly the Stilinovic work, which I said is, as I said, is the usually quoted one in this context, and to just point to the enormous productivity and creativity with which Eastern European artists, at least the ones that I sampled, worked with languages, and that it wasn't like you were saying, that it wasn't merely a matter of communication, but that there were many other aspects to using and working with and in foreign languages that went beyond the mere need to either communicate or upgrade one's status from a neglected Eastern European artist to somebody recognized or in the West. One of these was my idea that that learning a foreign language had to do with what I feel is an incredibly important aspect of work for Eastern European artists in the 60s and 70s, and that is intellectual self-perfection. That is to say, the idea that as a scholar or as somebody who works intellectually, you are able to contribute towards knowledge about art and things beyond art that you then, yes, will also be able to communicate. But that this labor of translation is also an end in itself. And certainly for Carl Friedrich Claus, whom I mentioned, this was the case. As I mentioned at the beginning, he began using foreign languages actually as a sign of resistance against the Nazis. So there's many ways in which the use of foreign languages and the study of foreign languages can be put to use, and not all of it is purely functional, purely directed at a practical goal, let's say, of communication. So that was quite important to take it out of this frame of the purely this interpretation of it as having to do with colonizing language versus one that isn't. Esperanto, I'm not sure. That falls into the rubric of insufficient field research. I have no idea who may or may not have used Esperanto in Europe at the time. But otherwise, these are obviously, Katalin, I've thought about using Ladik as an example, so certainly she would be a very interesting case, particularly because she comes from an area where already several languages were, as it were, available to her. Yeah, so one would want to think very carefully about places like Vojvodina and other areas of Eastern Europe where several languages, were at an artist's disposal who didn't want to use English, let's say. But thank you.
So thank you to the whole panel. I could ask each of you a question, but I will give one to Paulina and then just a comment on Alison's talk. Maybe it's not even a question to Paulina, but when you were showing these images of these outdoor exhibitions and basement exhibitions, I couldn't help but think of the almost fetishized photos of North American and British land art, and how formally those things, they look so similar, but from your talk it sounded as though art historians in the Czech Republic are resistant to those and to considering those worthy objects of study. And I think that with time, through the publication of them, they will become like those well-worn images of land art. And I know that the conditions for producing them were different, but I think that as we were talking about yesterday about how it will take several generations, I think that art historians in the future won't have these biases about that.
Well, I hope so. And we are working on it right now because we are, as I said, we are putting together this first exhibition, Histories of Czech Art, of post-war art, and we are very carefully selecting the exhibitions which we focus on, and we really try to be as pluralistic as possible, and we really try to get rid of these prejudices in our interpretation, and as I also try to propose, we really try to think of the positive sides of these kind of negative situations, So, and I think they are present. So yeah, I hope this will develop, and it's slowly developing. But it's also interesting when you talk to the artists. I am friends with Karel Miller for years. and he would never, ever mention this exhibition he had in Petr Rezek's apartment. And it was just a few years ago when he somehow mentioned it. I was like, oh my God, it's so interesting. And he goes, yeah, I have some photos of it, but he would never think of it like pulling it out, presenting it, it's slowly coming in. And as I said, some other artists, they just omit these exhibitions in their exhibition histories, and we have to change that.
Thank you. And I think that relates to what I was going to say to Alison. I really want to thank you for bringing pedagogy and teaching into this, because I think that is so important, and for all of us in this room, and about this idea of prejudice that, I have students who've walked away from my classes thinking that the Eastern European artists invented performance art. I mean, that was maybe an unintended consequence of me just presenting those artists. But I think I've noticed a shift in my teaching. I used to want to in response to Sven's comment about the sort of this almost danger of these random conglomerations of artists or images or dates. I actually don't think that what we're teaching our students, or what we should be teaching our students, is anything relating to a canon or canonical images or things like that. We're teaching them critical thinking, and if we can teach them that, then once they go off to do whatever, whether it's art history or something else, they will have those critical thinking skills to look at images and times and, without these prejudices, if we teach without these biases and prejudices, then that will, I think, trickle down to future scholars. So I was really glad to hear you bring teaching into it. Thank you.